Hi, my name is Alex. I'm the superintendent of Biddeford's wastewater department. Myself and the wastewater staff are responsible for maintaining Biddeford's 2 wastewater treatment plants, 23 pump stations, and over 60 miles of sewer lines. And I'm going to talk to you today about the wastewater process because it's something that we all take for granted, we all rely on, but very few people understand. Before we can treat the water at the treatment plant, we have to get the water there. So we have about just over 60 miles of sewer line and 23 pump stations. So when you run the water in your house or when you flush the toilet, it flows through a series of pipes leaving your house by gravity into another set of pipes that the city owns on the street, and all that flows through gravity downhill as far as it possibly can. And once it gets to a point where it has to go up, it has to come into a lift station such as this one so that the water can be pumped up again so that it can continue to flow through gravity. Once we've collected all the city's wastewater, it flows into this first part of the process, which is this is the pre-treatment building. So the goal of this building is to collect all the large items, rocks and sticks, and a lot of it is the material that people flush down the toilets and their drains that really shouldn't be in the sewers to begin with, like wipes that are advertised as flushable that are not really flushable, feminine hygiene products, toys, garbage, all the things that people put into the sewers. If they don't plug up the pipes or the pumps out in the street, they make their way into these channels, and then this equipment behind me collects all that garbage and stuffs it into these chutes where it gets compacted and has the water squeezed out of it so that it can be disposed of later. So this process is just about conditioning the water so that it protects the downstream equipment and prepares it for the next process. This equipment behind me here is the second part of the pre-treatment process, where the first part we removed all the floating garbage and we've taken that out of the water. And now we have to deal with all the inorganics, the sand and rocks that come in off the street. So this equipment is the second part of that. First, it runs through a centrifuge that siphons all that heavy material down, which then gets pumped out and it gets washed through this equipment so that it can be hauled away to a landfill. So after this process is done, all the waste in the wastewater is now dissolved in the water and it's ready to move on to the next step. So the next step of the process is actually, this is the primary method of treating wastewater. Most people that don't really know much about the work that we do, they assume that we treat water with chemicals or filters, but we actually harness the same bacteria that break things down in nature, and we concentrate it into these tanks so that we can treat a lot of water really quickly. So we add oxygen so that there's plenty of air in there, which helps reduce odors, and it also speeds up the biodegradation process. But the water is actually really just being cleaned by microorganisms that are just happy to feast on our waste. So our job is really just to establish the environmental conditions for the bacteria to make them happy. And you can actually, by modifying the conditions of your bioreactor, you can change the types of contaminants that you're removing. So the tank here is being aerated, this tank over here is not. While we're aerating, we are removing ammonia and we're removing carbon. And when we shut the air off, we're actually removing nitrogen. So by changing the condition of the tank, we can change how we're treating the wastewater. After the water is treated biologically, so we've taken the wastewater and we've fed it to bacteria that we've aerated and we've put in a nice, happy environment so that they can break down all that waste and turn it into more bacteria. And the bacteria starts to clump together and get heavier, and as it does, it will settle out from the water. So that's what these tanks are for, is it's essentially just a settling tank. So as the water comes in here, it has a nice, quiet environment. The bacteria will settle to the bottom and they'll form what we call a sludge blanket, and the clean water will float to the top where it'll go out over. And all that sludge that settles to the bottom that consists of bacteria and other microorganisms, we actually pump out and recycle through the plant again. So back in the previous process in the aeration tanks, we're constantly recycling sludge that settles in these tanks back there so that the bugs can again eat our wastewater and then settle out in the settling tanks again, just be recycled over and over again. And because we're constantly taking new wastewater in and growing more bacteria, some of the sludge or microorganisms has to be removed every day. And so not only do we recycle sludge from here, but we also waste sludge from here, which goes into a separate process for solids handling. This is essentially what's happening in those settling tanks. After the bacteria, which is this layer of sludge on the bottom, that's just concentrated bacteria. That's cleaned all the water up and then settled down, but the water on top is crystal clear and ready to be discharged from the plant. So after the biological treatment, which has removed about 98% of the contaminants in the water, the last phase is chemical treatment, because even though the water is clean, there is still the chance that there is harmful pathogens in the water that could make people sick if they come in contact with it in the river. So we use a sodium hypochlorite solution, which is essentially bleach, to disinfect the water and make sure that it's safe. And to treat roughly 1.5 million gallons of wastewater a day, we're only using about 50 gallons a day of sodium hypochlorite to disinfect it. So the whole process actually takes a lot less chemicals than most people assume. The second half of the chemical treatment process is dechlorination. We add the chlorine so that we make sure that the water that's going into the river is safe for humans, but the chlorine in the water isn't necessarily safe for the things that live in the water. So we want to add the chlorine to remove the pathogens, but then we want to add another chemical, which is sodium bisulfite, that actually reacts with the chlorine to neutralize it. So by the end of the chemical treatment process, we've killed all the pathogens and we've removed all the chlorine. And like I mentioned, we only use about 50 gallons a day of sodium hypochlorite to disinfect. We only use about 10 gallons a day of sodium bisulfite to remove the chlorine. And at this point, the water we've removed 98% of the contaminants, we've disinfected, we've dechlorinated, and now the water is safe and clean to put out into the environment. So over here we have an example of, this is what the water coming into the plant looks like. If you can see, it's pretty disgusting. Certainly not something that you would want your kids to be swimming in or catching fish in. And then here is an example of what the water that leaves the plant is, which is almost indistinguishable from the tap water that comes out of your sink that we all drink. So the goal of all this is to protect our waterways, because a clean waterway means a clean and safe environment for the people that live in the city. The Clean Water Act, which prevents anybody from polluting the river, was passed in the 70s. And prior to that, if you ask anyone that's been around Biddeford for a long time, they'll remember that you would not go swimming in the Saco River, you would not be fishing in the Saco River. And now, because of the work that we do to protect the water and clean it before we discharge it to the river, the fish are all back, the water is safe, people swim in it, and it allows the city to flourish and people to live their lives safely.